Okay. Let's start with this. We all know this, we're realtors. The average person buys or sells a house about every 7 to 10 years, with some exceptions, correct? At best, the buyer or the seller is way out of practice. I haven't done this in 7 to 10 years, maybe longer. Maybe this is my first time, at best. At worst, the realtor's out of practice too. It's like throwing a football. I don't care who you are. If you're Aaron Rodgers, when it's not game day, you're throwing the football constantly. Now, as realtors, we need to be skilled and expert at this. If we're not writing contracts every day, every week, constantly, we need to understand it. And some of that is practice, 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 practice. That's what we're doing here. Okay. Thing about it is intimidation of the contract. People are intimidated, especially a first-time buyer, or maybe a buyer who hasn't done anything in 20 years and all of a sudden all this paperwork is confronting them. They're afraid. Sellers as well. So are we sometimes. Newer agents have been known to show property on a Friday night or a Saturday day and talk the seller out of writing because they're afraid they can't get any help with the contract. They don't, because they're afraid to go forth with it. It happens. Sometimes people have been doing it for a while too, or thinking, well, let me study this up first. Okay. Now the cure for that is simply clarity. If you're clear about something, clear about anything, you have less fear, maybe no fear. If you don't know much about it, you're wondering, what did I miss? What did they miss? Or worse yet, not knowing that you did. Not knowing what you don't know is probably the biggest danger out there. So starting with this, the residential purchase agreement, what is it? It's an easy, simple thing. It's not called the contract. It's called the residential purchase agreement. Basically, it's an agreement between the parties, the buyers and the sellers, not the realtors, that outlines the terms of a title transfer and property sale. Each party has conditions and requirements to fulfill within certain timeframes. It's that simple. That's what it is. Someone asked what it is. Yes, we are going through some basics and we could go, oh my God, I know that, of course, but it's all part of this, all part of the process. So, but it's not just about that. It's not just filling out the documents, get it under contract, go. We know that, right? If you've done any business. This is our job. Everybody can see that? Navigate the journey, make sure everything's done on time, provide the clarity for the entire process, contract to closing. Here's your keys, Mr. Buyer, Mrs. Buyer. Here's your paycheck, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, right? So with that in mind, really, you have to think what could possibly go wrong during that process. Okay. So basically when you're in an escrow, it's like you're getting, it's your engagement. And when it closes, you're, okay, you're married, right? So just like with anything else, we start out with getting that relationship established. So let's start with the relationships. Break it down into pieces. This thing, we all seen this, right? It's like, oh my, okay, here you go. Here's your disclosure. This tells you what I do. These are my duties to you. Read it. That's probably how a lot of realtors present this thing, because it's like, we do so many of them, it's just the AD form. We don't even call it agency disclosure, we call it AD. But essentially, breaking this down, it talks about a seller's agent. And if you haven't done a transaction in 7 to 10 years, this might be of interest to you, I think. Okay. You operate under a listing agreement with the seller. You're an agent only for the seller. Okay. These are your obligations: a fiduciary duty, care, integrity, honesty, and loyalty in dealings with the seller. You also have obligations to the buyer as well. which is diligent exercise of reasonable skill and care, which is saying, you know what you're doing. You're going to give them a reasonable skill level. You're going to take care of them. Does that always happen with real estate agents here in Monterey Peninsula? There's about 1,400 of us. Nobody has to answer out loud, but the question is, does it? We're saying that we are in writing. We owe them, both parties, a duty. We need to be honest with them, be fair, operate in good faith. Okay. Just anything that you know to be a material fact, the other parties don't know, or maybe they do know and don't want to say anything. It's your job to disclose that. For example, you notice you go to the seller's property and you see a pooling of water in the garage after a big rain. It's not on the disclosures. It's nowhere. You talk to the seller, hey, what about that? Well, it's not a big deal. It doesn't happen that often. Should it be, and the seller doesn't want to disclose it. What do? You're an agent for the seller. What's a fiduciary? A fiduciary is putting the other party's interests before yours, right? You disclose it. You're obligated to disclose that. You owe that duty of fairness to the other party. You're not obligated to reveal any confidential information that doesn't involve these duties. That you're not obligated to do. Get more into that later. Okay. Buyer's agent, same thing, except you're operating for the buyer only with their consent. Okay. Back in the old days, it used to be, we all work for the seller. We're all agents of the seller. And some of the old timers out there might still have that in their mind, but that isn't the case. You work for the buyer. Same duties. Fiduciary duty of utmost care, integrity and honesty to the buyer. Fiduciary duty, the buyer's interest before yours. So it's not about I want to get paid, I want to get the commission. No, we're agreeing to put their needs and their interests in front of ours. A duty of honest and fair dealing, just like that. And the same thing, disclose material facts that might affect the value or desirability of the property. You might know something as a buyer agent. You say, oh, I don't want to tell the buyer because it'll blow the deal. It's over a fly zone. The airport just changed around, and now it's over. I saw planes going by all day. I shouldn't say anything. But once again, you're not obligated to do any confidential information. So now we get into this. You represent both parties. Okay. You legally can in California. In 42 states, you can. Where you represent both. This is tricky. This is really, really tricky. And you can only do it with the knowledge, not just the knowledge, but the knowledge and consent of both the seller and the buyer. They can say, no, I don't want you to be a dual agent. Okay. Now you have the same obligation to both parties equally. Fiduciary duty of utmost care, integrity, honesty, and loyalty, right? Okay. Now, but in representing both the seller and the buyer, this is tricky. This is important, actually. Without express permission. And what's express permission mean? Anybody?
Say it clearly.
Yeah, in writing. In writing. You cannot disclose to the other party any confidential info. That includes too, but not limited to, the seller or buyer's financial position, any motivation, like saying, oh, the seller, they have to move in 45 days. They have to. You can't say that to your buyer. Bargaining position, or any other personal information that might impact the price, including telling the buyer, well, the seller might take less. Or the buyer could come up a little bit. You're breaking your dual agency. That's why it's illegal in 8 states. There are so many lawsuits based on this. If you've ever done dual agency, if you've done it frequently, you have to have been confronted at some point with this question from one of your clients. Whose side are you on anyway?
Mike.
Who are you helping out? Right? Yeah. Some agents, some very, very seasoned agents won't do it. You have the listing and you have a buyer, you might take another agent within your own office and say, hey, for 50%, would you write this up and represent the buyer on this $900,000 property? Is that agent going to say no? 50, you don't, but do a referral, because there's a lot of lawsuits here with dual agency. So in essence, no matter who you represent, all parties are treated honestly and fairly. This document puts it in writing. We're one of the few professions that we put that in writing. It's that important. Now, the buyer and seller have responsibilities as well, and it's outlined here. We don't usually mention that to them, but they do. Okay.
Mike, can I back up a second?
Yeah.
I almost always ask, if I'm representing the buyer, why are they selling? I ask that of a listing agent.
Mm-hmm.
And invariably, they give me a reason. That goes to their motivation above. Right?
Yeah.
So that particular seller's agent should have in writing, oh, they're getting divorced. So it's okay if I tell people you're getting divorced, or, your kids, or whatever. But I am willing to bet that never is the case.
Right.
Or rarely is the case.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you have to be super, super careful here. You don't ever want to be in a position, why did you tell them about my divorce? Well, you told me to. I could in writing.
But even if it's some sort of, innocuous reason, like, oh, well, we just want a smaller house. This house is too big.
Mm-hmm.
Then you can't even say that, correct?
Correct. Because you're revealing motivation. It's like playing poker. Keep your hands on the keep your hand to yourself. Their hand to their hand. Unless they tell you. Unless they oh, absolutely. And if you're representing the seller, make that conversation happen in the initial listing appointment.
Mike, did you see Edward's question?
Go ahead.
Did you see Edward's question in the chat?
I have not.
Is dual agency still a popular practice since it sounds so tricky?
Oh yeah, people want to do that all day long. They want to get 2 commissions. It's super tricky. But it's super popular. Absolutely. I don't recommend it. As a broker, I don't recommend it ever, but it's legal. If you're going to do it, if you're a newer agent, I really recommend you get with another agent who will help you out, mentor you a little bit, or with your broker.
But
isn't it dual agent anyway if we're in the same brokerage?
Technically, yes, but then again, no, because you each have your own agency disclosure with your own individual clients. Okay. But dual agency is it's a subject of debate. It's been up. They have, from time to time, tried to make it illegal here. I mean, there are other states that don't allow it. I mean, that do allow, but you do most of the transaction, you have to involve an attorney. That helps somewhat. But what we need to understand is what is legal and what is not legal in California, and it does exist. And you may or may not be exposed to it within your transactions. And here's the thing that occurs too. An agent at an open house meets a buyer, right? Oh, I can get you a good deal. I can I know the seller really well, so I can let you know the inside. I can let you know the inside scoop. Work with me. Right? You're basically stating that you may or may not disclose confidential information. So be careful. Be super careful. If you have not done one before, if you work with Keller Williams, come to me. If another brokerage, go to your broker or go to an agent that you trust. That's done a few. So the buyer and seller responsibilities. Basically, it's just telling them that the purchase agreement itself will contain a confirmation of who's representing you. Sometimes they might get confused whether that agent represents you exclusively or is a dual agent. Pay attention. Make sure it accurately reflects your understanding. Okay. And all the stuff the agent's supposed to do does not relieve the buyer or seller from their own responsibility to protect their own interests. You hold their hand, but they're not your kids. The buyer and seller carefully read everything. Assure you adequately express your understanding of the transaction. A real estate agent is qualified to advise about real estate, not tax advice, not legal advice. If you need that, you consult a competent person that's a professional, an attorney or a CPA or your tax person. If you're a buyer, protect yourself as far including what you see to be true about the property and your inspections, everything. Do your due diligence. Both parties, again, it's reemphasized, get tax advice from a competent professional because there's some really tricky things about taxes. We'll go over that at a later time, not today, on the different tax consequences of buying or selling a property. But if you just say, oh, go ahead, and especially with people who haven't purchased before, especially people who haven't purchased or purchased much and they're not going to live in the house. There's a lot of misunderstandings that occur. And money is lost because of misunderstanding. Okay. So how would you present that document to your buyer? You're going to spend the time we just spent on it, and then you go, oh my God, that's just this. We got all these other forms too. Of course not. Because they're going to spend half a day reading. Maybe they will anyway, but you say, I'd like you to read this. But this form, here's a good example, a good script. Heidi, would you like to read this out loud? Heidi Theodore.
This form lets you know that the real estate brokerage, through its agents, that's me, can either represent a seller, just the buyer, or both buyer and seller in the same transaction. No matter who I represent, I must treat all parties honestly and fairly.
Okay. And I'd like you to read this. I mean, that's that. Pretty simple. Takes about 45 seconds at the most. They may, you may or may not point out some of the other pieces of it, right? Now, when should this be given?
In the beginning.
Yeah, before they sign the contract. When you pull up the purchase agreement from Zip Forms, this is the first form that comes up for a reason, right? Okay. And some agents have them sign this. If you're a buyer's agent, have them sign this document before you start showing property. Some listing agents, the first visit, whether you get the listing or not, say, this is not a contract. This is nothing. It just explains what I do. And they may not want to sign it. So what? Give it to them anyway.
But Mike, it doesn't just go along with your fiduciary, because we have a fiduciary.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. So then we go on to this. Okay. This is it's a mouthful. Possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent. Keep in mind, and consent. Break it up into pieces. Okay. The broker, and the reason it said individually or through its associate licensees, it means you. I may be working with many prospective buyers at the same time. Some of them might be interested in the same property that you are. Some of them might even make offers on a property that you make an offer on, right? I might be working with that. I'm a busy realtor, or I plan to be. Some of them may be listed with me. Some may be listed elsewhere. Okay, and I can't limit or restrict any other buyer from making an offer. I can't say, hey, I got a buyer working on this, so I'm not going to write an offer for you on any particular property, whether or not the broker or I represent other buyers interested in the same property. Now, this is another occasion where certain agents, seasoned agents, may just say, hey, I've got this buyer. I'm writing an offer on a property. I got another buyer who wants to write on the same property. Would you please handle that for me? And it'll be a one-time thing. I've been asked as a broker to do that for an agent. I say, sure, we'll do it. And you'll get paid. So I'm just disclosing to you that I've got other customers and they might be interested in the same properties, multiple sellers. Okay. I may have other listings on properties that are competing with yours. Right. And I'm going to market those properties hard too. I can't say, well, I'm not going to tell people about the property that's 5 houses down because I work for you. I work for everyone equally. Okay. And some of the properties that I list may appeal to other buyers who are looking at your house. They might buy the other house instead, maybe because you're overpriced. But for whatever the reason is, some may attract more people. And you might say, well, how come they're getting all the showings? They went under contract in a week. I've been on the market 60 days. What's going on? You're not, that can happen. But it basically says, really, that's this piece of the document. We have different customers, or we may. Okay. Next piece, back to dual agency. It's basically saying the seller acknowledges that I might represent prospective buyers of your property, and you're consenting to me acting as a dual agent by signing this form. You're consenting. They say, well, I don't consent to that. Well, then you have to do something different. You won't be able to represent them if they won't consent to it. If the buyer is represented by you and they buy one of your listings, it's the same thing. They're given approval for you to act as a dual agent. But on the other hand, in that dual agency, the seller and the buyer agree that you will not, without express permission, written permission of the party, the buyer or the seller, disclose any confidential information about what we talked about before, their financial position, their motivation, their bargaining position, whether the seller will take less or whether the buyer will pay more. You can't do it. Be careful. God, it happens so much. You can't do it. Do you think that your seller will take 900 on this 930 rather than say something like, well, yeah, I think he would. He's told me before. Oh, it's like, well, let's write it up and see.
Mike?
Yeah.
They're going to motivation here. So let's say we got a short sale. We're representing a seller on a short sale. Well, there's an obvious motivation there. We need to get some sort of written permission to, I mean, we're writing it up. We let the seller know it's a short sale. So we get some sort of written permission about that particular motivation.
Mm-hmm. Well, a short sale is a little bit different because that's a material fact that the buyer would need to know because it could be foreclosed in the middle. So the buyer, because back in the days of you were around, Patrick, in that too. I know you were, and you did a lot of business back then. But you know, there is a danger that the lender may not approve the short sale. All those different things. So that would be a little bit different, but you do want to let them know that, we're going to market it as a short sale, unless they're not in any danger of foreclosure, in which case maybe you don't, but still maybe you do, because there's the danger you get into a contract, the buyer does their inspections, et cetera. The lender says, no, we're not going to take the short sale. We have no approval. Even a pre-approved short sale, I've seen those break apart at the end too, back in those days.
Yeah.
8, 9, 10s, 11s, whatever. So yeah. Okay.
It sounds to me like you might just want to have the motivation discussion in any case and ask the seller, okay, exactly what is it okay for me to disclose and what is it not, and then memorialize that conversation.
Yes, absolutely, Patrick. And memorializing it is key. Hey, the sellers are moving to Florida to be around the grandkids. Come on, they might, maybe not, but have that discussion anyway. They may say, I don't want anybody to know what we're doing, because there may be that seller that will, so just get permission. You say anything other than the bones. Because one of the first things a buyer might ask is, why has it been on the market so long? Why are they selling? What do they need to move for, right? You've had those questions as a listing agent. And, so you got to be cautious. Because it could give the buyer the upper hand.
That's the main question too, Mike, is when you have a listing, is that the other agent is going to ask, or people in an open house, which we can't have right now, but anyway, is going to ask, why is the seller moving?
Yeah. Just be clear with your seller. If I'm a buyer agent, I'm going to ask for sure. Why wouldn't I? I want to know. If the listing agent tells me, Okay, great. I've got it one up. Why would I not ask that question? But as a listing agent, I'm going to get permission from my seller before I say anything. Say you're moving. One of the first questions you ask your seller at the table on your listing consultation is, well, tell me why do you want to move, right? They tell you, great, that's wonderful. When do you want to be there by? Okay, great. And then all those different questions. So you get all this information. And then, you say, we're going to market this property and we're going to be getting some phone calls from the buyers and all that. And they're going to be asking questions. And I just want to be clear of what I can tell them about I could just say, nothing. But usually the seller is going to say, that's fine. I don't care. I don't care. I don't care. But unless it comes to urgency matters. I mean, there's nothing wrong with someone retiring and wanting to move. But that doesn't mean they want to move quickly. It just means they want to move. Everybody has a reason to move. But if the reason is going to give the buyer a strategic advantage by pressuring them, and sometimes they go in at full price, knowing the seller has to move, and then 15 days into the 17-day contingency period, they go for this Hail Mary slam dunk $30,000 credit, right? Because they know the seller has to move. Of course they're going to accept it. They have to go. So just be careful. Use judgment. Use judgment. Always. That's an important thing. Have judgment. Use judgment. The more practice you get, the more judgment you're going to have. If you don't have a lot of experience, talk to people that do. Invite them out to lunch. Have conversations. Now, I promise you, you ask a seasoned agent some questions, unless you're just really nicking at them, they're going to be flattered. They're flattered that you ask them in most cases. Sometimes they're not, but mostly they are.
I have a question. Again, sorry about this, but anyway, on the buyer side of that, because we're talking about sellers and buyers, on the buyer side of that, like when you submit an offer, you can submit, I forgot the form. It's a form like an NDA where you can't talk about that offer.
Yeah, there is a non-disclosure agreement, which means you can do a non-disclosure on the identity of a buyer if you want, and a seller. There's plenty of ways to provide extreme privacy. Most deals though are not so complicated. Most aren't. What we want to do though is watch out for the 1 in 50 that is. It's like if your first deal is an easy deal, great. If your first 10 are easy, great. If number 11 is hard, okay, there's some experience. I like it if you get the hard stuff out of the way early. That's experience. And what we're talking about here is based upon the experience of people who have gotten into trouble, had lawsuits, sellers losing deals, buyers losing deals, etc. That's where all these documents and this complication comes into. That's why these forms exist. Over the years, things happen. Okay, we've got to clarify this. Everything's all about clarifying. Keep in mind, there's a lot of document, a lot of paperwork that the buyers and the sellers have to get and understand. And yes, it's been used as a defense in lawsuits. There was just too much. I didn't quite get page 19, section 6C. It can, but usually a judge is going to say it's your responsibility to know the contract. It's a contract. Okay. This is attached to the contract. It isn't a contract. It's a notice basically, but this is an agreement as well. This document here is an agreement that I'm giving you my approval to be dual agent. Okay, so now the next part of this is something a lot of people are not aware of. Your offer is not necessarily confidential. Technically, the seller and the listing agent could disclose every single piece of your offer to a competing offer. Did you know that? Unless all parties have signed that confidentiality agreement. This happens in multiple offers. Now, whether that actually happens really depends on current market conditions. I suggest if you're a listing agent, don't do it. Don't do it. You'll get a reputation really fast. And it doesn't always help your seller because things blow apart. I don't find it to be super ethical to shop like that, but agents do and agents can, and there's nothing you can do about it if they do. But it is prevailing practice in Monterey County that most of the agents don't, but they could. So be aware of that. Don't tell a buyer, well, it's all confidential in the multiple offer. The seller's not going to tell the other. I mean, for me, if I have multiple offers, I'm going to ask for highest and best. They're going to say, well, tell me about all the other offers. No. This also restates again, buyer and seller understand that broker may represent more than one buyer and more than one seller, and you consent to it. It's said again. Okay. How would you present this document? There's a quick and easy 2-sentence way to 3-sentence way to do it. Anybody want to say that one out loud? Patrick.
Yes, Mike. This form lets you know that I may represent multiple buyers and sellers at the same time. Some may be competing against you. If you write an offer, the seller and their agent may tell other buyers, everything about your offer.
Okay. Now, these just really may open up conversations. Good. Clarify stuff up front.
I might add to the first sentence that this form lets you know that I or another agent in my office represent multiple buyers, or sorry, I would say I represent multiple buyers and seller, and another agent in my office may also represent a buyer or seller.
Absolutely.
Against you.
Absolutely. You can add and you can edit this any way you want, but keep it as simple as you can when you're explaining it, and make sure that they do read it, because this will intrigue them enough to read it. But if you just hand it to them, it's like, oh my God, there's another document. Okay. Those are the states dual agency is illegal in, right? By the way. Okay. All right, the bad guys. This also comes up in zip forms quickly and early for a reason. Okay. Wire fraud. Obviously, this has only been a form that's been around for a few years. In essence, it's an advisory, because I don't know if you know, I know 2 people, 2 agents that have had clients where this has happened to. One, they lost $160,000 through a wire transfer, fraudulent wire transfer. The other one, they lost $500,000, or a little over $500,000 through a fraudulent wire transfer, and they never recovered it. So basically, what happens is the bad guys can intercept emails, and they're looking for key frames. I'm not going to tell you how to do it because I don't know, but they do. And they masquerade as the title company, as you, and they get susceptible buyers and sellers to say, okay, I'm ready for you to wire transfer your closing funds or your deposit, whatever that case is. And the buyers and sellers think, okay, great, things are happening. So in essence, it advises, get the phone numbers and account numbers only from the escrow officers, and make sure it's the right escrow officer. Don't ever wire transfer prior to calling to confirm the transfer instructions. Even if you get an email from your title officer that says, go ahead and do it, call, because they'll masquerade as your title officer. Only use a phone number that you were provided previously. Okay. Orally confirm the transfer instructions legitimate. Confirm the bank routing number, account numbers, and other codes before doing it. Okay. Avoid sending any personal information at all in emails or texts. That includes social, anything, your bank account numbers, that kind of stuff. Don't do it. Do it in person or over the phone to the proper person, to the escrow officer. Take steps to secure the system you're using with your email account, like strong passwords. Jamie, at one of our meetings, had quite a tirade about that, for good reason. Using secure Wi-Fi, like you may not want to do it at a Starbucks. And if this did happen, it gives you some information, the FBI, National White Collar Crime Center, et cetera. And hopefully no one ever has to do this, but it happens. It happens. It's kind of like, if you don't know someone that has happened to, you probably know somebody else that, you know me, because I know 2 people that it's happened to. So luckily they weren't my clients.
Okay, so Mike, it's Heidi again. All right, so a client, let's just use a hypothesis here. A client sends their bank letter that's proof of funds that goes with their, lender letter. What about that? Can you discuss that, please?
As far as the attachment? Yeah.
Yes, they proof of funds. So it has their bank information on it. It's proof of funds.
When you send proof of funds, I don't know that I recommend including the full account number or anything like that ever. in any kind of correspondence. Let's
I
see.
don't, but I just wanted you to say it for the sake of the class. I always tell them to go ahead and black it out on that
Yeah,
lease
yeah.
statement.
Yeah, they can always get confirmation from the banks, et cetera, as long as the buyer provides permission to verify. So don't ever put account numbers or anything on any correspondence or attachments. Careful. Okay. So basically, if you want to describe this form, modern day crooks use the latest methods to interfere with wire transfers of money. This form advises you of the risks, ways to minimize the risks, and what to do if this happens to you. Please read this, because this happens to people. That's how you might want to present this form, very simply. It may open up a conversation. Some people say, well, I'm just going to do checks. All right, they can if they want. I don't dispute. I think wire transfers are great, but you got to follow precautions. Okay. All righty. We are on to the meat and potatoes here. And keep in mind, when we finish the purchase agreement itself, there will be a lot of other forms that go with it that we'll discuss, further on down the road here. But what we do, the purpose of this whole thing, we go as far as we can till 10:30, and we will pick up where we left off on the next time. So we're not going to time it in. I want to leave plenty of room for questions and discussion if we need it. Okay. So here we go. Let's start with the details. We're going to kind of write a contract and go through it, which is a little simpler than just showing you the blank documents. So we basically have buyers and sellers and our property, the price, who represents who, the type of closing, etc. We're going to keep it really basic and really simple. Okay. So breaking it up into little pieces. This is basic. We all know how to do this. We just fill in the blanks on zip forms, right? Okay. Well, starting with the date prepared, which is very different than the execution date of the contract. That's just the date that you wrote the contract. That is not the date the contract is effective. Not many people are confused about that, but once in a while someone is. That's why I bring it up. So simple. The buyer, this is an offer from Jonathan B. Good and Connie C. Good. And this is what they're buying. The address and the AP number. Okay. And just like writing a check, and Zip Forms fills this out, you're writing the dollar amount, $950,000, we'll say. Okay. And let's say we want a 30-day escrow. Now, one of the things about this piece of it here, you need to have a conversation with your lender, with the buyer's lender. Can I do this in 30? I mean, what's my time frame? How soon can we turn this thing around? If you don't have that conversation and you write up a 30-day escrow and they say we can't close for 45 days, you might have a problem. Okay. And then there's a debate. Should I put a date instead? Today's July 8th. Let me put in August 8th. Why would you not do that? If the lender says it'll take 30 days, why would you maybe not do that?
Maybe it's excluding weekends.
No, not necessarily. Why would you not want to put a date?
If something can go wrong, it probably will.
There's that. And what about the negotiation period for this contract? What if I put August 8th and it takes us a week to negotiate it? I forget to change the end date after it's finally negotiated.
Oh, yeah, because maybe you didn't remove contingencies or something wasn't, maybe you didn't remove physical contingencies.
Well, you just lost, but here's the thing. You go to August 8th, you just lost 7 days if you don't get it accepted till July 15th.
Mm-hmm.
But if you put a day, here's the thing about putting days. What happens if you do a 30-day escrow and the 30th day falls on either a Saturday or a Sunday? When is the closing date? Is it Friday or Monday by default?
It's afterwards.
Sure?
Next business day.
Are you sure?
Well, if you look at the definition of word days later on in the contract, it mentions that.
It's
Okay.
after. Patrick's right.
Okay. Are you 100% sure?
Yes.
There's okay, you're right, but there's been a debate on that, and because it's impossible to close. But here's a problem you might have. You could have is on any day, and actually we'll get into that a little bit later towards the end of the contract, so we'll stop on that. Okay. So that's part one, section one. By the way, there's 32 sections in the contract. Everybody knew that, right? You tell your buyers there's 32 sections. This is section one,
I
basically.
usually use my teeth to count them.
Perfect. Okay, agency. Who's working for who? And what are the side effects? This is important. Some people forget to fill this out or they fill it out incorrectly. And let's say that you're on a time crunch and you get everything accepted, everything's worked out, and you forget and you miss a box here. The seller's gonna, the listing agent will very likely counter you. And what's the danger of having a counter offer out? You know, perhaps another offer will come in. That happens. So watch your P's and Q's on this one. So, but in essence, this is disclosing who, who's working for who. Keep in mind, this piece right here is automatically checked, which is the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. It's going to be assumed this is part of the contract. Okay. So in essence, we're going to confirm agency. The seller's brokerage firm, listing agent is Monterey Realty. You're going to put in their broker DRE number, which will be in matrix. They represent the seller. Okay. Seller's agent is Robert McGee. And you're going to put their license number, which is right in matrix as well. Okay. Actually, that would be, it does take a little bit of look. If you don't put it in there, they will, and they might give it to you in the form of a counter. Okay. Be careful of that. Buyer's brokerage firm. Let's just say that when you check the box, they represent the seller only. Sorry about that. Okay, let's say it's AW Coastal Estates. If you're here, put in our AW's brokerage license number. Okay, you represent the buyer, your name here for buyer agent, and then your license number. And then check off you represent the buyer only. Okay, now if it's dual agency, you're obviously going to check off both the buyer and the seller. And part C, that's confirming. Everybody confirms, okay, that's who represents me. That's who represents the other side. Potentially competing buyers and sellers, it goes back into that. This says, and it's checked off by default, that you have provided that document and they've signed it and they consent to the relationship. Okay?
Someone mute their phone, please.
Yeah, there's some noise. Okay, there we go. Thanks, Heidi. Okay. Any questions, discussion on agency, section 2? Pretty basic, cut and dry, right? Okay. Let's go on then. Section 3, we're getting into the interesting stuff, the money. A lot of pieces on the money section. It's going to address the deposit, how they're going to pay for it, proving they have the money, what effect the appraisal has, what are the terms of the loan, and beware buyer credits. We'll talk about that. Starting with the deposit. Okay. In essence, buyer's first going to say that, hey, if I write a check, the funds are good. Or I'm going to wire transfer, I have the money, basically. They're representing they have the money. Typically, if you look at liquidated damages, which we'll get to later on, not today, 3% is the maximum amount that of damages the seller can get if there's a default by the buyer. So if you put down 3%, you're going to have the seller's attention. Now, not everybody does 3%. Sometimes it's 1%. Sometimes the buyer doesn't have enough cash to put a full 3% or even a full 1%. So they put an even amount. There's different ways of doing it. 3% is always a safe bet, but it does vary. It does vary. And I've seen it vary here between 1% and 3%. But this is just like full price will always get the seller's attention so long as it's worth the full price. So will the 3% here. So you're looking at how they're going to pay. By default, it's direct deposit by electronic funds transfer. Maybe they want to drive over and do a cashier's check or overnight it. Maybe they want to do a personal check. Don't let them do cash. But they have within 3 business days after acceptance, unless you change that to get that to the title company. If they do 3%, that would be the amount on that $950,000 sale, just by the way. Okay. Part 2, we don't do this at our office, and I don't believe most of the larger offices do either anymore, which is to leave the check with the agent, which means you log it into your trust account, all that, not your account, but your trust records and all that. You're better off not to do that because you're dealing with a lot of record keeping, you're dealing with lost checks, etc. The modern way, especially with wire transfers, is to have the buyer get it to the title company. Increased deposit, sometimes adequate. Maybe the buyer only has 1% now and they'll deposit 2% later. Maybe they'll wait until after the contingencies are over. Who knows? Maybe there's different reasons, but they, fairly frequently, they will do an increased deposit within a certain amount of days after acceptance. Okay. And if the parties agree to liquidated damages, they also agree to incorporate the increased deposit into the liquidated damages. We'll get into that at a later time, but that's just know that it will be part of liquidated damages. Okay. Cash or loan. How are they going to pay for it? Is it all cash? Great. They don't need a loan. Not contingent on a loan, but if it is cash, show us the proof, show us the money. And you're always better off to attach it and not say within 3 days. Most listing agents are probably going to ask for that before advising their seller to accept the offer, unless there's some kind of extenuating circumstances. But just be careful. If you're going to do cash, show the money. Okay. Loan, by default, they're going to put conventional. That's why it's up there first. So the first loan in the amount of, in this case, we said it's going to be 20%, which would be $760,000 on a $950,000 purchase, right? So typically it's conventional, but if it's not conventional, you check off the box FHA, which may not occur with limits, VA, which could, or seller financing. A lot of you have never dealt with seller financing before, but some markets it's very common, and it does happen here too on occasion. Not often for first loans, but not frequently, but once in a while for second loans. Assumed financing, I can't remember the last time I saw that happen. That's where basically the buyer takes over the seller's financing. That's rare, if at all. Or other. And other may be something, for example, we have one that's being worked on currently where the buyer is going to secure the funds to purchase on a different property. Okay. Or maybe going to get it through a HELOC or something to that effect. That's an other. You're going to put it at a fixed rate not to exceed whatever the current rate might be. Put that there, or whatever the pre-approval letter says, better. Regardless of what kind of loan, points not to exceed this. If all of a sudden the lender says, we're going to charge you 2% or something to that effect. Yes, there are lenders like that. You want to make sure that you're protected as a buyer that, hey, wait a minute, I didn't get my terms. Second loan, you see these from time to time. And the main reason for getting second loans is to avoid PMI.
Owen, why are you being like that?
Okay, so in avoiding PMI, you need 80% loan to value, and you don't have 20% cash to pay for it, to put your down payment. So you might get an 80% loan as a first and maybe a 10% loan as a second and have 10% down, or an 80, it could be any different thing, 80, 95, 5, or 80, 15, 5, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you do get a second loan, you disclose it and you're going to put down, the same thing, what the rate's going to be, which is usually higher on a second. Is it adjustable, et cetera, points, et cetera. But you disclose all the terms and make sure you provide your pre-approval for that second loan as well. Usually the first lender can, if you're dealing with the broker, they may be able to get both loans for you. They usually do. But sometimes it's a seller financing as a second loan, okay? And it's not, the seller's not really loaning you money, they're just financing the unpaid balance. They are and they aren't. But be careful of this. If you can't qualify for a different type of loan and the seller loans you 10% or 15%, make sure that by doing so that you still qualify for this. So you need to disclose that to your lender that that's happening. You don't want a last minute blow up situation. Okay. If it's FHA or VA, there's a few different requirements. There is a document that needs to be delivered to the seller. It's in zip forms, FVA, and there's a few different requirements sometimes on the appraisal, etc. It's maybe a little bit different, a little more stringent. So just be cautious of that, and just be aware if you're newer and you haven't done a lot of these, that sometimes sellers, especially in older homes, are a little bit wary of accepting VA loans because of those terms, their fear of it. And sometimes the best thing is to have the lender maybe clarify to them that it's not so bad as it used to be. It really isn't. VA is a great program, provides a lot of great benefits. You can do 100% financing with VA if you're a veteran. So don't, the worst thing you can, it's a VA, we can't accept it. Be cautious of that. Be cautious of discriminatory practices as well. If there's any, yeah.
Can I go back up to there where you put in the interest rate and the points bit up there in D1? So I understand it's pretty obvious how that protects the buyer, right? If the interest rate should jump up
through the loan contingency only, right?
So so the loan contingency protects the buyers. Now, Marty, our esteemed attorney there, he says, and I can't remember his explanation, maybe you know, he says that paragraph, by filling in those blanks, because a lot of agents leave those blank. Marty says by filling that in, say the 4% and the 1% there, that it actually protects the seller as well. Can you address that?
Yeah, it does. It kind of does, because if it changes, the seller may have an out. Possibly. So it does. It really, in essence, it says, this is what I'm going to get. And you could leave it blank. Most I find don't. If you leave it blank, you're probably not going to get countered. But if you're a buyer and you get approved for a 4%, or 3.5, whatever it might be, and all of a sudden you're not approved for that, and you say, I'll give you this loan, but it's going to be 5.5% or 5.25. You know, now you have evidence that you don't qualify for the 4% loan, and you can back out. You still qualify for the loan, but you don't qualify at that interest rate. So
right, so that gives the buyer an out. It protects the buyer, because if it's 3.75, and now, you know, the interest rate has changed and this buyer is going to now be, you know, house poor or mortgage poor, they can back out. It gives them an out, correct?
It could, yeah, if they want it out. What I found is that most of the time they're going to do everything they can to stay in. They're not looking to get, I got it, because they got plenty of outs already with the regular contingencies. This just really, it's just a clarification of what their intent is. You may have particular listing agents who are going to demand that you put that in there. They're going to counter you back. Please complete D1. They might. Some won't. Very few will. Very few even pay attention to it, but you might. I'm all for, if I have a good offer, I'm all for avoiding counters because I want to get this thing under contract quickly if I represent a buyer.
Almost every time I've filled that out, I've gotten pushback from the listing agents.
Mhm.
Most of the listing agents I see around here want that blank, or they just want outrageously high numbers in there.
Are you putting an outrageously low number in there?
No, I put, whatever the lender tells me.
Right. Does it match? Is it on the pre-approval letter?
That's a good question. I don't know.
If it matches that, I don't see how they can possibly push back. But if it's not, and you're just pulling a number that you think is prevailing rate, yeah, I'd push back too. I think I'd want to see the evidence that it's going to be that.
Yeah, Marty had a great argument about how it protects the seller, but I can't remember. I'll send him an email
Right.
and see what he has to say.
Yeah. Be interested in seeing that, Patrick.
Okay.
All right. So going on, if there's any additional financing terms that aren't covered up here that need to be, then basically this is to clarify what you're doing. That's where it goes. Okay. Balance of down payment or purchase price. In essence, this is your down payment minus your deposit. It was up earlier, right? If your deposit was $28,000, $28,500 was our deposit on this property, right? Remember that? So $28,500. The down payment, 20% minus 28.5 is this. And then Zip Forms does the math for you. That's the purchase price. Don't try to do math. Let it just fill in the numbers correctly and it'll be filled out for you. Prevents mistakes. Back in the triplicate form days, there were some bad mistakes made. Okay, so that's how you're going to pay for it. So into showing the money, always best to include this with the offer, verification of funds. Basically, you got a proof of the loan, but show me that you've got the down payment money plus funds to close. And by default, you may have 3 days to do so, but some listing agents may ask, some may not. I always find it best to include it because it also shows that you really are serious about this. And this is what we got. We can get this thing wrapped up today. Let's go under contract. Okay. Verification of funds. Effects of the appraisal. Now, obviously, by default, it is contingent on an appraisal. Now, what if you have a cash offer? Is it still contingent on an appraisal by default?
It is by default if you don't check the box.
Yes, you're right.
But a buyer can opt to still have that contingency, even if it is a cash offer.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. So basically it's saying that yes, it needs to appraise, has to be at no less than the purchase price. And the buyer shall remove this contingency within 17 days, or if you put something different, you put something different. And then you get into, when we get into it later on, what if it doesn't appraise? What are the buyer's rights? They could cancel. They could come up with more cash. The seller could come down on the price, or they can meet in the middle. There's lots of different options for it. But because you miss appraisal doesn't mean, oh my God, the deal's over. Not necessarily. Loan terms. We're still on the money.
Mike, also on the previous one, that's where you would click the date because that would populate the contract, correct?
Mm-hmm. But say that again, Heidi?
On the previous page, it showed the date blank. That's where you would click on that, so it would populate the date, correct?
Right, yes. In Zip Forms, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so it says here within 3 days, buyer's going to give a pre-approval letter. Come on, include it with your offer. You check this box right here, letter attach. Okay. If you try to submit an offer without it, it's a rare occasion. They're going to say, okay, well, 3 days is fine. I mean, it can happen in extenuating circumstances, but just happens.
Especially if you've got a multiple offer situation.
It's yes, absolutely. Okay, but follow best practices and just have it all prepared ahead of time. The contingency. Now the buyer needs to act in good faith to get that same loan that they said they're going to get. But being able to qualify for that is a contingency of the agreement unless it says otherwise. And if it, let's say the buyer says, I don't need a loan contingency. Okay. Then do a contingency removal with the contract. But don't ever advise your buyer to do that. It's not safe practice. But sometimes in multiple offers, they do that. If there is no appraisal contingency or it was waived or removed, then if it doesn't appraise, then the buyer can't cancel because of that. Now the buyer can try to negotiate the price and do all those other things, but you can't just cancel for that reason alone. Okay. As far as removing the loan contingency, by default, there's 21 days. Okay. There used to be a checkbox that, I lost it here, that said during the term of the agreement a few years ago. That's like saying up to the last minute. But basically within 21 days, the buyer in writing needs to remove that loan contingency or cancel. Now, if the buyer doesn't remove it in 21 days in writing, it'll just continue on unless the seller does a notice to perform to say, get it done or I'll cancel, remove the contingency or I cancel it. If there's an appraisal contingency and you remove the loan contingency, that does not automatically remove the appraisal. They're separate. Just remember that. If you check off no loan contingency, it is not recommended, but sometimes they do in a multiple offer. Okay. All pretty
Mike,
clear?
I got a question.
Okay.
So with the loan contingency removal, if there's a problem with the bank getting the appraisal done in time or for whatever reason, you can do the extension of time addendum. Is that correct?
So long as both parties agree, yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
I think
And
I did that on one of my transactions. That's why I was asking about that.
Oh yeah, and that's as we get later on in the program, those documents and those procedures, excluding demands to close and that sort of thing, will be discussed too. All that, but absolutely do an extension of time if you can get them to agree. And they usually will, unless they have another buyer or they're frustrated with you. And also, it also brings to light on that sort of thing. You're asking for something from the seller, right? That's why it's so important from the very beginning. When we talk about relationship, the relationship between the buyer and the seller is established by how the realtor's relationship is, right? If the two realtors are battling and they don't have good vibes, and do you think that the other agent is sometimes going to tell the client how difficult they are? And the client's only feedback on that is what my agent told me. And if you do the same thing, remember, as a realtor, you know, your job, you're the conduit of information, So no matter what's yelled at you and screamed at you, that sort of thing, you just deliver it to your client. Because if you're going to create a bad thing by saying, oh, they're so hard, they're horrible, they're bad beat, and then you have to negotiate something, does it make your negotiation easier or harder? So try to keep the good relationships and from the beginning as much as you can. That's not always possible, but you know, because the buyer and the seller, they're business partners. They're both working towards a mutual understanding of getting the seller moving and the buyer moving in, and the seller getting paid. And the realtor should also look at their relationship as business partners, just like two attorneys going at it, right? Defendant, the plaintiff, etc. And those attorneys could just go at it in court and just rip everybody apart, including what those questions that are asked, objection, Your Honor, all that sort of thing. But they might be out, you know, having a beer later on at the pub because they're professionals. You know, they keep the relationships. It's so important, that relationship. That was my little opportunity to get on my bandwagon. So there we go. Okay. Buyer credits. Keep in mind, it's not just an open thing where let's write an offer for $50,000 over ask and then ask the seller to credit us that $50,000. Make sure that the lender's okay with it. Not just the credit itself, but the amount of the credit, because there are limits. I mean, you could, like during negotiation for repairs, that's usually when you get credits. Sometimes buyers, they ask for it up front because they don't have the cash to close. So they ask for credits to cover the closing costs, but they got to be really careful how much they ask for, because if it goes above the closing costs, they can't take a check home. The lender won't allow that. So the seller gets to keep the money. So be cautious on the amounts, because it has to be disclosed to the buyer's lender, or it's what? What is that if you don't tell the buyer's lender? You write a check outside of escrow, something like that, that'll cover it. What is that called? Anybody? Pardon me? Say that again?
Lending fraud?
Yes, lender fraud. You don't ever want to be called for that. You don't ever want to get a letter like that. If the total amount, if the total credit allowed is less than what the contract says, then the credit shall be reduced to the lender to make it to the allowable amount. Okay. And then there might be, maybe the seller, maybe the parties will agree to just lower the price by that amount. But if it doesn't happen, then the seller keeps the money. And by lowering the price a few $1,000s, that might not help the buyer at all. It might make a difference of a few bucks a month on their payment and the property tax, just a little bit. So just if you're gonna go this route, whether it's upfront, and if you go upfront, and let's say you ask for credits, because sometimes buyers have very low cash, but they're very well qualified and they can get a loan, and their cash to close has to come in the form of credits, and they don't mind paying interest for 30 years on it. Okay, that happens. But then later on during the negotiation for repairs, they ask for a credit in lieu of the new roof or whatever. The lender may not allow that. So be cautious. Okay. Yeah. So there's the highlights of it.
Can you talk about non-recurring versus recurring closing costs, and maybe not putting either if you want a credit toward the closing costs from the seller to the buyer? Well,
closing costs are things that a buyer has to pay for prior to closing, and it's outside of the loan. A non-recurring closing cost might be, for example, the buyer's escrow fees. Okay. A recurring closing cost, let me think of one there. Something that they'll pay for now, but it's going to come up again after the buyer takes possession. But to cover yourself, credit to go towards recurring and non-recurring closing costs, it gives you a few more things that you can pay for. I mean, I've seen contracts go through with the buyer coming out with zero cash, that having to pay, they pay nothing. They get or maybe they pay just the down payment, but that's it. No costs at all. Lender fees, that's a non-recurring closing cost. That sort of thing. Sometimes lenders provide credits for those sorts of things. Sometimes in new construction, they provide credits for things like that. But what you really need to know is that if there's going to be any types of credits at all, check with the lender first. Always. Just make that phone call. Say, hey, the buyer's going to want, is that going to work in this? Is it going to affect anything? Usually it's fine, unless the amount is too high. That's the biggest glitch I've seen. Okay. And as it says in Part K, the seller's relying upon the buyer's representation that they're agreeing to all of this. And in essence, what it says is, if you change your loan midstream, disclose it to the seller, because the seller has no obligation to cooperate with that new loan. Oh, we got a better interest rate. Oh, we're switching over to VA or whatever, or we're switching from VA to conventional. The seller's relying on you getting that first one. The seller doesn't have to extend the time frame because your lender says, well, I can get you this great interest rate, but we have to close 5 days later. Seller can say no. So what you do is you disclose it to the seller, and the financial terms, perhaps in the residential purchase agreement, maybe the down payment changes. You may need to amend that in the contract, so that underwriting gets a hold of the contract. They see it's 20% down or whatever the new terms are. And keep in mind, the seller doesn't have to cooperate. And I've seen it happen where we change loans and, we just don't say anything. Let's just make it happen with the close. Nothing's going to change. And then, the seller has a backup offer that you don't know about. And so we need 5 more days. Here's a demand to close. You better close by on time or you're out. Just be careful. Be careful. Most of the time they're fine. Unless it extends the time frame and their moving dates are all messed up in that. You don't want to be dealing with that. Okay. All right. Now we're on section 4, and this is probably as far as we're going to get today is doing section 4. Controversial. Does the buyer have to sell their own house first? In section 4, by default, your ability to obtain a loan is not contingent upon the sale of your property. But if you check this box here, then I can only get financing if I sell my own house first. So I'm going to attach this addendum as CAR Form COP. And we're going to review that. Okay. Okay, it's a single page. It looks like this. Some of you have seen it. Most of you have seen it. You haven't. And let's go through it in pieces. It's an addendum to the purchase agreement. Okay, we got all the information filled out. And let's break it down. The first thing is the buyer's property that has to be sold in order to qualify for this loan. We'll say it's at 304 Oakhurst in Salinas. And the agreement is contingent upon this property closing escrow, buyer getting paid the funds, the proceeds, and using those proceeds to close on this new house in Pacific Grove, right? It has to close by the earliest of either the scheduled close of escrow of our original purchase agreement right now, or a date that you specify differently in paragraph 3, which is down here, see? Let's say it's going to close in 15 days. That's when it has to close. Okay. Within 2 days after the closing, the buyer needs to provide in writing, hey, we closed. Sometimes it might not be a bad idea to provide evidence of the cash that you got out of it, but just really all you have to do is provide express documentation that we're done and evidence of closing from the title company. Okay. Continuation of contingency. It can only be removed in writing. Okay. But even if the buyer removes this contingency, unless the buyer also performs all the other actions in the contract, seller can still cancel. Once the buyer property closes, this contingency can no longer be used. It becomes null and void. It doesn't exist anymore once you close. You can't just say, well, we closed last week, but I've changed my mind and I'm pulling out because of the contingency. You can't do that. You can't do that. Okay, so that's kind of the terms of it. Then you go to part 2, which is, all right, let's say the buyer's property is not yet in escrow, but it's listed. Either it is or it isn't. Be honest, because you're going to get checked. If it's listed, the listing broker is hopefully you, but if not, it's somebody else, maybe in another town, and put in the MLS number. Why would you want to do all that? Why would I put the MLS number in there?
Show proof.
Yeah, prove it. Okay. Right. So the buyer, has set by default, has 17 days after acceptance to go into escrow, unless you change it. So make sure if you represent a buyer on this, that you've got a well-priced home. If you got an overpriced home, good luck getting this accepted. And most listing agents are going to check. They're not going to say, oh, okay. Most of them are going to want comps. Most of them might run their own comps. Okay. I've actually gone through as a listing agent and toured the house and looked through it with the agent and the seller and my buyers to make sure that we feel it's priced right as well. So once you enter escrow, the buyer within the time specified, provides sellers with copies of the contract, escrow instructions, etc., proving that it's entered escrow. Now, I don't believe I would provide any confidential information about the other client. I might block that out of there. Sometimes just providing a letter from the title company and the execution page, acceptance page on the contract's enough. But by this form, you provide everything. But let's say that that's if the buyer's property is not under contract already. If it is under contract already, put down when it's scheduled to close per contract, who the title company is, and what the escrow number is. Same reason as before, because I guarantee you the listing agent is going to verify that. If you're not the listing agent, they may also ask for permission to talk to the listing agent or the buyer agent for your house, for this other house, or buyer and the listing agent, actually, if you're not involved in it, and ask, how's it going? Is it strong? Are they past contingencies? What's going on? They're going to investigate it. And the buyer within 5 days delivers the evidence that's in escrow, but I would provide that along with this form, and the offer is show evidence immediately. But don't provide any confidential information on the other buyer. Cancellation of the buyer's property. If the property goes, the buyer's property that has to sell in order to buy the new house here, if it goes under contract and it gets canceled, the buyer within 2 days has to give the seller written notice of that cancellation. You can't just say, oh God, we lost the contract. Let's hope we get it back under contract really fast. Technically, if you do that, you're in default. Do people do it? You think? In a hot market, they might, they do, but contractually you cannot. Going on to the second piece. Okay, where do we go here? The seller's right to cancel. Okay. First, the seller has to give the buyer a notice to perform, to provide documentation that your property did indeed close, if it doesn't close escrow by the time you said it would. Okay, they can do that. They can boot you out. After first giving the buyer notice to perform, the buyer does not provide escrow evidence within that time, can cancel. So the seller can just say, hey, I'm tired of waiting. You never got your house under contract. I give you notice to perform. I can cancel. Now, they don't have to cancel, but they have the right to cancel once they issue that. Now, the buyer's right to cancel, you can do so. If it doesn't close escrow, you can cancel. Or if the buyer, if you are in escrow and it cancels and it's out, you can cancel the escrow. Okay? So this is a delicate balance. It's a domino sometimes. I've seen it where there's been 3 or more homes in a chain. They all have to close at a certain time, and that can get a little bit wonky, but I've seen it work too. Okay, this is important. Time periods. By default, this is the time period in the contract we're writing right now for the Pacific Grove house. By default, they start on day 1, just like they always do with the contingency period and all that, right? But if check this box, the time frames for the contingencies, basically, and the 30-day close and everything else, only begin on the day after buyer delivers escrow evidence. Or, okay, let's go ahead and start them now, which basically they elect in writing to start. That puts all the leverage on the buyer, to the buyer there. So be careful. Or if the buyer removes the contingency, then the time frames can start if this box is checked. That's rarely accepted by a listing agent, but sometimes it is. That's how a short sale typically works too, but we're not talking about short sales today. The buyer's deposit too. By default, it's given to the title company, just like normal, right? Or if you check this box, within 3 business days after any of the following, either escrow evidence for the buyer's property, buyer's election in writing, you're going to go ahead and start the time periods, or the contingencies removed. So the buyer, by checking that and the seller not seeing that which is usually the case of why they'll accept it, is stating that you don't even have to give a deposit until your house goes under contract, thereby minimizing your risk. But it is an option there. And I will tell you, this is a document, whether you represent the seller in receiving the offer, representing the buyer and delivering the offer, be very careful here. Very careful. You don't ever want your client to say, why didn't you tell me about that? So backup offers. Seller right to have the buyer remove the contingencies or cancel. Okay. After acceptance, seller has the right to keep offering the property up for sale for backup offers. So the seller puts it up for sale, contingent, accepts a written backup offer. It's better than yours. And then the seller will provide you, the buyer, a copy of the signed accepted backup offer. Okay. I know we've been in contract for 30 days. You know, we love you guys and we'll have coffee one day, but hey, I got a better offer. That happens. So A, the immediate right to notify buyer to remove sale of property. The seller has the right to immediately give written notice to buyer in writing to remove this contingency, remove the loan contingency, if you have one, and provide verification of funds to close escrow without this contingency. And if you don't complete these actions within 3 days after delivery of that notice, seller can cancel and boot you out, no matter how long you've been in. Okay? That doesn't sound sometimes so good to the buyer, right? Or if checked, watch this one carefully. You haven't dealt with this part before. Delayed right to notify the buyer. If this is checked off when you present as the agent for the buyer, seller shall not invoke the notice provisions up here within the first 17 days by default, or maybe you want to put 30 days. Or maybe you can get real brave and put during the term of the agreement. Okay? And that really protects the buyer. It doesn't protect the seller at all. But the contract itself protects the seller. If it's a 30, 60 days close, you still have to close, whether your house is sold or not. But as a buyer agent, that's ideal. Check this. Or as a buyer. As a seller, that's the worst thing that can happen. So as you can see, there's a lot of controversy with the contingencies to sell the house. And that's why a lot of sellers and a lot of listing agents never recommend to their sellers to take it. And this is the least you need to know on this. A lot of sellers are very hesitant. And sometimes when they do accept it, they're going to expect better terms. They may expect a higher price than you would normally pay. You may be paying, you may not have as much negotiation room because they're saying, hey, we're taking a chance on your house even selling. And even though we can still offer it for sale as a backup offer, a lot of agents aren't going to write on it because they're just going to, I don't want to write on a contingent property and waste my time. And so we're taking a risk. So you're going to share in the risk and pay us more. If the buyer's house is already under contract, make sure you provide evidence up front. If it's not under contract, provide some comps. Don't make the other agent do it. The other agent might anyway, but provide them anyway. Be nice about it. This house is priced to sell. And keep in mind, the seller might accept a backup offer and cancel you out. That is never good. And be clear on the delayed right. It's a buyer protection, not for the seller, but address that. Because otherwise, if you don't address that piece of it, then you could be booted out at any time. You're kind of every day that the buyers are going to have a hard time going to sleep at night. Is another offer going to come in? I don't know. So try to negotiate something there on a contingency. And if your buyer has, a plan B in place, for example, they really can sell it without a contingency, but they got this accepted, make sure they're prepared to provide evidence that they can, should they get, booted out with this. Okay. So best practice on this, because you're not going to get a lot of practice on this because it doesn't happen that much, but maybe it will as the market picks up. Prior to executing your contract, reread the whole thing I just showed you. Go through it until you're crystal clear on it and you can fully advise your buyer or seller of the benefits and the risk. Because we can talk about it now and go, oh yeah, I get that. And then weeks pass, maybe months pass, and you finally deal with one. Don't just read the thing. There's so much on there that you need to be aware of. And your client, your buyer expects you to know that like the back of your hand. Now, you don't have to know it like the back of your hand every morning when you wake up, but when it'll take you 10 minutes to get to that point if you read it prior to. Okay. And I think that's we're almost done at the right amount of time here, and it's about 10:30. We could go on and on, but I wanted, like I said, we're taking this in small bites. And next Wednesday, we plan to start at 9 o'clock again. I hope y'all make a point to come again, and if we're going to get through probably another third of the contract then. And are there any questions that we haven't addressed here?
Mike, I'd like to just make a comment. You've done an excellent presentation. As a seasoned agent, I've been through these classes and seminars for many, many years, and you've done a terrific presentation. I look forward to the following ones coming up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay. And great. So I'm looking forward to it too.